Good morning. I'm Gayasha Paranamana, and I've come here to present the role of local religious centers to alleviate poverty and inequality from religious practices to spiritual empowerment. So, moving on to the introduction of the study and the core problem, material solution alone, such as income, infrastructure, and technology, have not stopped poverty from reproducing across generations. Why? Because the missing link is poverty is multidimensional. It's persistently rooted in conditioned mental framework of both poor and wealthy individuals. Its internalized beliefs, values, emotional responses perpetuate inequality. External aid changes environment but leaves internal structures untouched, altering condition without shifting the mindset that reproduce inequality. So, moving on to the literature review of the study, the traditional view says that poverty is material deprivation of income, consumption, and basic needs. The extended view, however, shows that the poverty is multidimensional, construct of social exclusion, agency, dignity, and capabilities. The internal dimensions, however, focus that mental condition derives positivism, dependency, and acceptance of inequality. While when we consider spirituality, it is about self awareness, compassion, resilience, and empathy. When it comes to religious centers, it is actually offering moral guidance, education, and social capital, but also risks falling into ritualistic practices and short term charity. So, when it comes to the research gap of the study, the observed gap is that spiritual well being is actually rarely integrated with economic or social outcome. And in doing so, spirituality is actually being studied in isolation in comparison to poverty. And therefore, it actually remains marginal in mainstream development research. So, when it comes to our studies contribution, we would actually use poverty, position spirituality as a mediator between religious engagement and poverty outcome, and in doing so, we would actually measure it through observed attitudes, thinking patterns, and well being. And in doing so, we would actually frame poverty alleviation holistically, where inner change paired with external development. Because as a pilot study, our aim is to highlight patterns and open pathways for future researchers towards a more integrated understanding of poverty and social equity. So, moving on to the research objectives of our study, the first objective is to examine how local religious centers can alleviate poverty and inequality through spiritual transformation. And then our second objective is to identify obstacles that would actually limit this transformative effectiveness. And lastly, our third objective is to propose policy recommendation from shifting from religiousness to spirituality. So moving on to the method of the study, we have used a qualitative design in the Kobeigane division of Sri Lanka, which was chosen on the basis of active and influential local religious centers, using a purposive sampling of 20, where we have actually integrated Likert scale data combined with qualitative interview analysis to gain deeper insights and feed observation. This allows us to capture how participants interact with these centers and to analyze how its rituals and moral instruction shape internal mindsets. So, when it comes to the results of this study, first we will look at the analogy of the mind as a computer. So, when you consider about the computer and the human mind, both have programs. When it comes to the computer, they cannot act without the programs. Just like that, the humans are actually governed by our beliefs, habits, and conditioning. And in doing so, when we operate from these programs, we have a self centered behavior, and that will subsequently lead to inequality, unhappiness, and unsustainability. But what makes humans special than the computer is that we can actually transcend these behavior patterns. And in doing so, we could actually operate from the unconditioned spirit mind. And therefore, we would be whole centered, which would subsequently lead to equality, happiness, and sustainability. So let's look at the path to spiritual empowerment to transcend these conditions. First, we'll take a look at the conditioned mind. It's actually driven by desires, aversions, and self-centered behaviors. It is like rainwater trapped in gullies, flowing in fixed, narrow paths. But unlike that, if we consider the unconditioned, freed mind, it is actually sensitive to self, others, and the nature, which would actually positively respond. And in doing so, it is like rainwater spreading freely on open ground. So when we operate from the unconditioned mind, it's like inner change. We should have inner change in both poor and wealthy segment. And in doing so, we would have individual progress, reduce inequality, and greater sustainability. Therefore, it is crucial to operate from the unconditioned mind rather than the conditioned mind. So, moving on to the primary cause of mental conditioning and inequality, which was driven from the qualitative and observational findings, we can see that in our findings we recognize similar conditioning across both ends of the economic spectrum. So, when we take a look at the poor segment, they have attachment to small comfort, they have aversion to struggle and failure, they have a sense of self helplessness and fear of risk. In doing so, they have a victim mentality and scarcity mindset, and they have lower self worth. But when we consider the wealthy segment, they operate from an abundant mindset, which actually resulted in attachment to wealth, luxury, and comfort. They also have aversion to discomfort, loss, and instability. And they also have a sense of separation from others. And in doing so, they have a belief that wealth is a sign of personal worth. And when we consider in overall the poor segment, they have overall a scarcity mindset that is marked by risk aversion, low expectation, and adaptive preferences. While when we consider the wealthy segment overall, they have an abundant mindset that often manifests as resource hoarding, entitlement, and socio-economic elitism. So, when we consider this, the primary conditioning is what governs both the poor and wealthy segment. So, their likes would lead to attachment, and their dislikes would actually lead to aversion. And in doing so, it would lead to like self image, where they would have self centered behaviors, and it will subsequently lead to separation of self and others. And at the same time, the secondary conditioning of their beliefs, attitudes, habits, religious and political ideologies also play a significant impact on this conditioned mind. And recognizing these codes have helped us to see how deeply both scarcity and abundant mindsets are conditioned and how they interact to perpetuate poverty and inequality across generations. So, when it comes to the primary codes of qualitative and observational findings, we see that the poor segment is driven from a scarcity conditioning and short term adoption. Therefore, they operate from survival oriented decision making, where they have a fear of failure, risk avoidance, and learned helplessness. But on the other hand, the wealthy segment has a fear of loss, where they have competition, social distancing, and the normalizing of inequality. And the wealthy segment has a narrative that they obstruct inherent advantages and exclusive networking because they believe that it is self earned success. And the combination of this has resulted in a scarcity and privilege conditioning that reinforce each other, where they reproduce inequality across generations. So, moving on to the objective one of our study, we have examined how perceived power and influence of local religious centers. Our survey results show that these centers hold strong influence within the community, providing psychological comfort and a sense of inner peace. But the most striking finding is the mean score of 4.2 that highlights that their power is that potential to deep seated mental conditioning. This suggests that the community recognizes these centers as institutions capable of changing mindsets. But the real challenge, however, lies in how effectively this power is being used. So, moving on to the obstacles of our second objective, our findings reveal that religious centers play overwhelming emphasis on rituals. While these rituals provide comfort and belonging, they do little to encourage critical reflection or transformative change. Teachings are often presented as fixed truth that will reinforce conformity rather than inquiry. As a result, people tend to accept the situation passively, and the centers end up preserving the status quo instead of opening pathways to empowerment. So, moving on to limitations of local religious centers, building on this, we have identified broader institutional limitations. Many centers foster a us versus them identity, which would actually divide the community instead of uniting them, where leaders often lack training on psychological or counseling skills that are essential for helping people shift from this mindset. And in some cases, leaders themselves remain caught in ego and competition that would also foster more of prestige than collective well-being. These limitations mean that these centers risk reproducing the very patterns that they are meant to challenge. Therefore, it is crucial to overcome these limitations. So when it comes to the underutilization in our objective 3, so our findings showcase that the influence of local religious centers are being underutilized. While they provide compassion and emotional support, their impact is on structural inequality remains minimal. These issues are not access. People can reach these centers easily. The real limitation lies in orientation. They remain focused on rituals and comfort rather than transformative developments. This leaves the broad potential being untapped. Therefore, it's crucial to utilize these centers. So, when it comes to the proposing policy recommendation on shifting from religiousness to spirituality, we would actually propose that there should be a shift from rituals and doctrine to transformative spirituality. Leaders need personal transformation to guide authenticity, and in order to do so, they should receive training on psychological, trauma informed counseling, and awareness practices. And we should actually encourage dialogue between tradition and universal spiritual principles. In order to do so, we should have greater emphasis on awareness, compassion, responsibility, and freedom. Because as per our findings, the respondents do recognize the potential that these centers can go beyond. But the problem is that we should have a cautious approach and have gradual change in order to do so. So, when it comes to the conclusion of the study, local religious centers hold strong moral influence, and their influence is directed towards rituals and belonging rather than transformation. Therefore, in doing so, they actually operate from a conditioned mindset of both poor and wealthy that will reinforce the inequality. But we should actually have greater emphasis on spirituality that would go beyond conditioning and then that can positively contribute to socio-economic approaches. Because in our study, it is even though it is localized and a pilot study, it highlights the pathway to integrate spirituality into poverty reduction. So therefore, it is crucial to actually consider about spirituality in that aspect. So these are the references of the study, and thank you.